Okay, so hello again, everybody, and I'm glad that you're all happily munching on cookies to get your blood glucose levels way up so that you can immediately go into a deep slumber. You'll be happy to know that I changed out of my morning pajamas. I'm now in my gym shorts and tank top. So I'm in my afternoon attire. I have the duty to sort of set the stage for the early afternoon talks, and I'm just going to remind people about that spill that happened in the Gulf, and then kind of provide some context about the need and the structure for seafood testing. So, you know, you see, first of all, you see in the title slide here, or the lack of title slide, you see a flow chart that demonstrates kind of the process that happens when there's an oil spill and there are fisheries issues. But, you know, the reality is that many people worry about markets, and so that's what you see on the right-hand side. It was a sign that was posted in rouses all through Louisiana during the spill. So this is what I'd like to talk about, basically to remind you, as the bullet says there, as if you folks really need to be reminded about some facts of the spill. We'll talk about the closures, and I really want to set the stage for Gina and the other state folks who are going to be talking after me, just in terms of why we do closures and how it works. And then if there's time, and I really hope there is, I want to use my soapbox to just talk about a couple of lessons learned and maybe look ahead to the future if this ever happens again. So yeah, there's the culprit. That's the drill rig, and of course the accident, and then the festering hole in the bottom of the ocean. We're all very familiar with these things, unless you were asleep 5 years ago. But here are some factoids about the spill, just to remind you. And so, I put first and foremost that there were 11 fatalities. 11 men died in the initial accident. This thing went on for 3 months. I've got there 2 different figures for the estimates for oil release. One was calculated by the scientists, that third bullet, calculated by the scientists. The fourth bullet is the total that the U.S. District Court used in the court proceedings. And you can see sometimes we forget that a lot of gas was released from the wellhead as well. So it was about half and half, or roughly 60-40 or 40-60 in terms of oil and gas that were released. A lot of people in the Gulf. I spent much of my 2010 in Houma, Louisiana. And then just the bottom line, for the maximum extent of the federal fisheries area that was closed during the spill. And of course, I have to mention or just show some slides of the various response methods that took place. Skimming, upper left, dispersants, of course, upper right, in situ burning, lower left, and then one of the many mechanical or physical methods, the top hat, that were attempted to try to just cut off flow from the wellhead. And then to remind you of the oil budget, where did all of that oil that was released go? This was the final scientific estimate that was put together by the Federal Interagency Group, and it gives you kind of a low estimate and a high estimate and the middle ground. So that's the distribution or the fate of the oil as the scientific agencies viewed it right after the spill. So, what's interesting is that there was a fair amount, you can see at the very top of there was a fair amount of oil that was directly recovered once they figured out how to do it correctly. Okay, and so I show this slide just to illustrate kind of the difficulty in doing mechanical recovery during oil spills. You can see that we're limited by how much oil we can encounter with these physical methods like skimming. So you can see the relatively large size of the slick compared to the area that's being skimmed by the two vessels. And at the response operations, you know, the numbers are staggering. The largest application of dispersants, the most oil that we've ever burned operationally during a spill, and then again at the bottom, the amount of oil that was recovered directly at the wellhead site. And I pulled this summary on the right-hand side from a publication. You can see there it was ECO. And some of these numbers are not entirely correct. I mean, I showed this to some of our NERDA folks who were working on the case, and they said, yeah, I don't know about this. But it just gives you an idea of where the settlement money is hopefully going to go. The bottom line there, I had to change because it was adjusted slightly in the final analysis. So, and then for those of you who aren't familiar with the settlement process, what remains to be done, there's a public comment period that is going to be open until the first week in December. Then the final damage assessment and restoration plan is issued, and then hopefully the judge in New Orleans signs off on it. But there are still a number of civil suits that are pending. Okay, so let's talk about why you are all there, and that's for seafood and fisheries. As is the case for any moderate to large oil spill, fisheries are closed to keep potentially tainted seafood from being caught, and then secondly from being brought to market. And so the first fisheries were closed in early May during the spill, and the area that was closed, the federal fisheries waters, were grew progressively through just before the time when the wellhead was capped. So what you see here is a cumulative footprint of oil, where oil was observed from satellite. So this isn't all at one time. It's just every time there was a footprint of oil that was noted by the satellite folks, it was added to this map. So based on that, this is the full extent of the federal fisheries closures that took place in 2010. And I noted in looking at this thing that it kind of resembled a handgun pointed directly at Brownsville, Texas, but that's besides the point. So one of the issues with closing a fishery is that you have to figure out how to reopen it. So once you squeeze the toothpaste out of the toothpaste tube, how do you put it back in, or can you? And that's really, anytime that there's an oil spill where we close fisheries, that's the challenge. How do we reopen them? So here's the very simple process that NOAA and FDA came up with for reopening the federal fisheries that were closed during the spill. And I'm saying that facetiously because, you know, this is a lot of fine print, but you can see the steps that were laid out by NOAA and FDA to reopen fisheries. You don't have to read all this because I have handily translated it into this summary. So basically, before the closed waters could be reopened, there couldn't be any oil, visible oil present, and every seafood sample collected in those closed areas had to pass a two-part test. And so that two-part test, the first part was sensory testing. It used to be called organoleptic testing. Now we call it sensory testing. And it's basically smelling and tasting the seafood to see if there is evidence of taint, which at the time and afterwards was subject to a lot of ridicule. Oh, they're protecting our seafood by sniffing it. But I think the truth of the matter is your nose is relatively sensitive to low concentrations of volatile hydrocarbons, so it's not a bad way to go. You can probably get, with your nose, get down to parts per million levels of contamination. Those of you who attended Clean Gulf last week may have seen a presentation on using canines to find buried oil on beaches, and they can get down to parts per billion levels. So olfactory sensing is not necessarily a bad way to go, but that sensory testing was backed up with the chemistry, and Gina and the state folks are going to be going into a lot more detail on what took place with the chemistry testing. So I'm going to wrap up my introduction just by talking about some lessons, and we're going to be hearing later in the afternoon about communications. Excuse me, communications about seafood and fisheries issues. And during the Deepwater Horizon, that was part of the challenge, was to try to explain to the lay public what we were doing and why. And the additional challenge was to recognize that we had a multicultural audience that we needed to try to reach. And so what you see is a fact sheet that we produced in HOMA about oil contamination in seafood, but as most of you probably know, there's a very strong Southeast Asian fisheries community in the Gulf of Mexico region, and so you see the same information sheet translated into Vietnamese. So that's something that we really hadn't thought about in advance of the spill, but something that should be kept in mind as we move forward into the future. And as far as fact sheets go and explaining how this process works, I remember being very impressed by the state of Mississippi's outreach effort, which I thought did a nice job of explaining the process and then presenting some of the information. So, part of the challenge in this whole seafood and fisheries issue is being able to get people to understand the science behind it. Now, the other thing, and this was my pet project in HOMA, it's something that I tried to get going in anticipation of seafood and fisheries issues, and based on our experience from other spills like Exxon Valdez and the North Cape spill on the east coast of the U.S., we knew that fisheries and seafood contamination were going to be a problem, and I was hoping that we might be able to get ahead of it in the incident command post in HOMA. So I wrote up a charter for something, being a federal employee, I had to have an acronym. So it was Fisheries Advisory and Seafood Team, and we, as you can see on the right, we got Admiral Landry to sign off on it, and you can see who we had involved in this little team that we stood up in the incident command in HOMA. And the idea was to both try to interpret information coming in from the outside about seafood issues, and then figure out how to communicate that from the incident command out to affected communities. So you see, we were in Louisiana, so you see strong representation from the state of Louisiana. We had Louisiana Sea Grant, US FDA, and NOAA. And NOAA brought in a seafood expert from the state of California who has been writing their plan for oil spill and seafood issues. So I thought it was a pretty robust group. Unfortunately, we ran into issues with basically trying to get our message cleared by the state, and they were not really us putting out a message that was not coming from the governor's office. So in this case, it didn't really pan out to be an effective group or an operational group at all eventually. But I would recommend in the future for responses that people start addressing these issues right off the bat. Yeah, so there's the signature. Finally, I wanted to tell you about project that we undertook in NOAA that was very interesting from the intersection of in-situ burning and fisheries, which we hadn't anticipated as well, and something to think about for the future. So what you see here is a boom full of oil that had been burned at sea in one of the many in-situ burn operations. There was a tremendous amount of oil that was burned at sea. In fact, about the same volume that was spilled for Exxon Valdez wound up being burned in the Gulf of Mexico during Deepwater. The interesting thing about that burn residue was that most of it tended to sink. This is a close-up of some of that burn residue. It's kind of taffy-like. And I don't know if you can tell in the picture, but it's sinking. It's not right at the surface. It's subsurface, and much of it sank. And here's another shot. So very viscous. If you remember the lecture this morning about viscosity, it was much more viscous than the original oil, but its volume was much, much reduced. So that's the trade-off. What was unexpected, this is a map of I guess I'd better go through this in a little detail. You can see the location of the wellhead right in the center where that yellow dot is. The red crosses are where burn operations took place. And then, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here along this, just inside the 500-meter line here, you see these lines. And these are locations of shrimp trawls, deepwater shrimp trawls. I think it's the only deepwater fishery in the Gulf of Mexico. This is for royal red shrimp. And in this case, the red lines that you see here were areas or shrimp trawls where yeah, I have my own soundtrack with my presentation. What you see are trawl lines, and this is the red lines are where the trawls encountered. Well, these are the shrimp, royal red shrimp, and you see.
Jerry, it's Larissa. Can everyone who's on the line make sure you press *6, just because we're hearing a little noise, and it's just a little distracting. Thank you. Go ahead, Jerry. Sorry.
Okay. So royal red shrimp, you see where they can be found, and they have pretty broad distribution. They're kind of a niche fishery, but they are, in fact, a commercial fishery. The problem was that in the fall of 2010, the trawl fishery began bringing this up, which is sort of a mass of very tarry, oily residue along with their shrimp, which is not good. So a number of chemistry analyses took place, and both during the fall of 2010 as well as subsequently, and we did a retrospective analysis and fingerprinted this stuff back to the burning of Deepwater Horizon oil. So the lesson here is that in-situ burning is, I think, a very nice tool to have in that proverbial toolbox. We haven't seen very many interactions between fisheries and in-situ burning, but this is one, and it's something we'll have to keep in mind in the future if we want to use this technique on a broader scale. So, I think, yeah, this is the last fishery closure of the whole spill, and this happened in November, but it was opened up in fairly short order after testing of the shrimp took place. So just to review again what we went through, we went through the facts. We gave you just the general outlines of what happens with closures, and then sort of my personal perspective on some of the challenges ahead and what we might think about in the future. Any questions?
Thank you, Gary.